Welcome to the Business of Business podcast. In this episode, Lewis talks to Phil Walton, Head of Finance for Central, Eastern and Southern Africa at ICCA. Phil made the decision to step away from the corporate world in the USA to make a difference to the lives of the people of Africa. By using his own experience in corporate finance, he is able to help communities create their own future. I hope you enjoy.
Just over 3 years ago, I left for 6 months, and here I am, 3 years and 3 months on. With no real plan to return, but it's been quite a ride.
So, have you still got the place in Los Angeles?
Yes, that's always our kind of backup plan. We have a condo in Huntington Beach, and that's easy to rent by the ocean, so that's pretty nicely covered. It's always been our kind of escape plan as well if things don't quite work out. That and a sister-in-law in Los Angeles.
Okay.
But that's kind of cost neutral, which meant that as long as we had some form of income whilst we were traveling, and suddenly that source of income turned into a career, kind of in a very gradual process. That caught us by surprise. So that meant there's no burning urgency to return.
So, and we're just kind of getting straight into things. You, obviously from the UK, you moved to LA. Your background was originally in finance, right? And then you switched over to business development sales.
Mm-hmm.
And that was that at the time when you moved to the US? That you switched from?
No, that's actually halfway through my 25 years in the US. In fact, for 10 years of my sales background, I used to introduce myself as a recovering accountant.
Right.
And I made a great play on the fact that I escaped the finance profession and was now in sales, which of course in the US is kind of considered quite a lofty profession, rather than in the rest of the world it's seen as a bit of a dirty job. I was kind of always pleased that I've moved into a more of a people career rather than a numbers career. And of course, you never really escape finance. It has its clutches on you, and it kind of pulled me back. And that's exactly what I'm doing now. I'm back in truly a finance role, though working for my current organization. It has a lot of commercial aspects to it and general management as well, which is perhaps where I found myself more in general business management than true debits and credits and grant management, which is the slightly drier side. I did. I moved into sales and ended up getting back into finance. Got back in.
So you were, last time I saw you, you were in Huntington Beach. You then moved, as you say, 3 years ago to Malawi. So the first question I have is, what made you, what made you go sort of not give it all up, but at least push it to one side and fly halfway around the other side of the world? Presumably you've never been to Malawi before. So what was it that, what was the reason for the move and why Malawi at that time?
Right. So thought you might ask that question. So I've been thinking about that. So I think we know where Malawi was, first of all. It's kind of a small country in East Africa. So Malawi was kind of a combination of circumstances, but the real push was, in fact, sales in the US. I thought I was a salesperson. And then as I realized, as I stayed in sales longer, sales has become somewhat of a science in the US. That people talk about hunters and farmers, and what I really didn't like in sales is when you made a new sale, that the modern convention is to hand that over to the implementation team, and basically you built a relationship with the customer and then you cut it off, and then you then hand it over and you never talk to that customer again. And I realized what I really enjoyed was the ongoing relationship with customers. And I decided that corporate sales in the US wasn't something I really wanted to do in that kind of hunter-farmer model.
Yeah.
And then, but at the same time, I thought, well, okay, so what do I want to do? And I really decided to take a break. And then the idea of traveling came up. And then going overseas, working in Africa, I always describe myself as a devout capitalist. I really am a believer in business and economic activity through business.
Yeah.
And that was really at odds with what I considered to be the NGO, the development sector. You know, I felt that was typically a lot of tree huggers and well-intended people, but not business people.
Yeah.
But I stumbled across a small British NGO that specialized in setting up solar resellers in Malawi.
Okay.
And they needed to build a sales distribution network to help provide solar lights into the rural community in Malawi.
Yeah.
And the concept was the more sales agents they had, the more children could read at night.
Right.
And it's kind of ticked all my boxes, really. It
Yeah.
had kind of sales background and a finance background. And I kind of believed in what they did. And that was solar aid.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the bridge to Malawi.
Yeah. And did you do that as a volunteer rather than
yes,
and
exactly. And my wife is a finance analyst as well.
Okay.
Finance background. That particular NGO had two positions: one requiring somebody to help with their credit collections and inventory and kind of sales operations, and they needed a kind of a temporary finance officer, which is the role that I took.
Yeah.
That rapidly evolved into a kind of a general manager position, which of course was something I felt suited to, and I don't think I've ever enjoyed as much anything I've done before.
Yeah. Yeah. And I suppose kind of building up to this, what was it like going from Huntington Beach, California to Malawi? I mean, anybody listening to this can imagine the culture shock and the culture difference, but are there particular things that stand out in the early days of being in Malawi, the job, the people, the culture that, you know, that really stood out for you?
Well, yes. I remember the thought of heading off to what was described as the poorest country in the world that's not in conflict. And that was the statistic at the time that was used to describe Malawi.
Yeah.
And then on the way there, we went via the Solar Aid headquarters, and they kind of casually told us that often they run out of water and there's rolling power cuts and it's terribly poor. And, you know, you suddenly, it became very real when we were on our way there. And it was exactly that. It was a terribly poor country, swarming with these well-intended NGOs who were, in hindsight now, doing more harm than good. And it's a country with very limited hope and natural resources.
Yeah.
So it was a big shock to coming from California, but at the same time there was a feeling like you could make a significant difference quickly.
Yeah.
And that's maybe something that's harder to do in the US and large corporations in particular. You're a small cog in a big machine.
Yeah.
But in Malawi, we were able to influence change in a small way, but quickly. But it was a big culture shock. But there's ways to settle, and there's always kind of a local community. And to me, also the big secret was football.
Right.
I'm a big football fan, and Africa loves football. So if you like football, you can go to any bar and you're immediately surrounded by friends.
Yeah.
That was my technique to integrate. My wife, meanwhile, did Afro dancing, and there's lots of dance classes, and now that's how she met her social network.
Okay.
But it was a big culture shock.
Yeah. And when you say football, we're talking about the football you play with your feet, not the one here in the US that you hold with your hands.
We're talking about yes, Manchester United and the real beautiful game. Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
And it's funny, you walk down the street in Africa, and every other person's wearing a 1995 Manchester United shirt, or an Arsenal shirt is another common one, because all the secondhand clothes, particularly old sports shirts, end up in Africa.
Right.
So you're surrounded by like a retro parade of football kits, soccer kits.
You mentioned something interesting there about other NGOs causing more harm than good, and you mentioned there's swarming.
Mm-hmm.
What do you? Could you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, exactly. So there was probably the most famous one was I think it was the British government funded the distribution of malaria nets and to various communities in Malawi. And when they returned a year later, they found that all the malaria nets they'd given to families had been sold by those families to fishermen who stitched them together to make nets, who completely destroyed the fish population in Lake Malawi.
Right.
So, there's one of those, when you give things away in not a controlled way, it can do a lot of harm. Another example would be all these secondhand clothes that people give to Oxfam, the Salvation Army, etc. They get packaged and sold in pellets of clothes in Africa,
right,
and then get distributed and sold by people on the street. You walk down the street, people selling secondhand clothes.
Yeah.
And initially you think that's great, except it's completely decimated the garment industry in Africa. It's destroyed it. There used to be lots of clothes manufactured in Africa, but they can't compete with free clothes from the US.
Okay.
People feel good about giving clothes away, but they're actually, in effect, destroying an industry in Africa.
Right.
And in the solar sector, we had an NGO that bought 10,000 lights from us before I got there, actually, which was too tempting not to sell that particular NGO those lights.
Yeah.
Who promptly then gave them away to one of our regions, all the villagers in one particular region, which destroyed our sales agent's business overnight.
Right.
So the whole concept of gifting, which is often part of NGOs, is often designed, I think, to make people feel good.
Yeah.
But it doesn't generate economic activity. That's back to my passionate belief that if you can generate economic activity, you help people more than handouts.
Yeah.
And we saw that a lot in Malawi.
Yeah. That's never even would have thought of that. Like you say, to give your clothes away, you feel like you're doing a good thing. The idea of the malaria net seems like a good thing, and yet basic economics come into play, I suppose. You mentioned in your LinkedIn summary about the fourth sector, and I think this is a good segue into that, because the fourth sector essentially is a sector economy which consists, I was reading this earlier, consists of 4 benefit organisations that combine market-based approaches of the private sector with the social and environmental aims of the public and non-profit sectors. I suppose really then, if you were to make a difference where you are, it would be to help people economically, build businesses, employ people, and enjoy the basic economic benefits that we would do here in the US or UK. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. I often describe this fourth sector as like herding cats. It's trying to organize the government, NGOs, and the private sector to come together and address all their interests. And that actually is why I've ended up at my current NGO, ICCA, because that's exactly what they do. And so a very specific example would be we help farmers generate more value from their crops. It's very typical for a farmer in Africa to grow enough food just for their own consumption, not to sell, because they don't have access to a market. So part of what we do is help farmers grow better quality crops and connect them to what they call off takers, the people who refine those crops into products to be sold worldwide. We've had projects in Kenya where we've helped farmers freeze dry mangoes that were sold around the world.
Right.
Or probably my favorite project is we've helped Heineken source barley from farmers in South Africa so they can brew beer made with local products rather than importing it from Europe.
Okay.
So a subject dear to my heart.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of the way I believe you help developing nations is really building sustainable value chains.
Yeah.
And there's many aspects to that. That's access to finance, it's training, it's for farmers, it's access to seeds and fertilizers, and also connecting the markets together.
Right.
And that generates jobs and it generates wealth. And we've got proven examples of doing that.
Yeah.
Rather than just giving free tools or subsidies away, that doesn't do any good. It's more about generating that what we call a value chain.
Yeah. So you mentioned the ICCO. Could you just explain who they are? Who is the organization?
Yeah. So we're headquarters in the Netherlands. Like many of the European nations, their original network in Africa was through churches.
Right.
So there will be a network of, in our case, Protestant churches throughout Africa. And that's how the Netherlands, in my example, used to implement their aid programs. They used to use their connections through the Protestant church, through East Africa, and that was the kind of the implementation network is through the churches. Well, ICCO is 55 years old, and it's developed into a kind of a multi-faith organization rather than a Protestant church-based organization. But still, it's grounded on a church network.
Okay.
And it is the common theme with many NGOs in Africa. That's how they were established.
Yeah.
But we were spun off from the Dutch government, and we're now the independent NGO implementing multiple projects funded by the EU, the Dutch government, even the MasterCard Foundation in the US.
Yeah.
Implement these kind of agribusiness projects all around the world. My region is just East, Central, and South Africa, but we have a presence globally.
Yeah. And so from Sunny Money to the ICCO, what happened there? Did you have to leave Malawi? Did you have to finish up with Sunny Money? What made you change?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, I fell in love with Malawi. I really wanted to stay. I think my wife was keen to move elsewhere, but we both realized that we did what we set out to. When you come to a developing country, I think you have to go with the intention of leaving. You've got to look to mentor and guide the local team to take over your position.
Right.
That's, that should be the objective. And in Malawi, we were very close friends with my sales manager and operations manager. And after a year, it was clear that they could take the organization forward. I think my role was done. Yeah. And if I stayed there any longer, it would have been for selfish reasons. So it was a really difficult decision. And probably the one that I'm most proud of, that we left the organization in the hands of Brave Mahoney, who's the general manager of Sunny Money in Malawi. And it's gone on to do some fantastic things in Malawi.
Yeah.
And we stay in contact, and it was what I think you should do as an expatriate in a developing country is mentor, coach, and move on.
Right.
And then actually returned to the UK for a few months to look after my mother, who wasn't very well at the time.
Okay.
But we'd already been to Uganda on a vacation and fell in love with the country, and then I found ICCO, and I saw their focus on business creation and generating, I think, sustainable livelihoods in the agribusiness sector, and that kind of spoke to my capitalist kind of core.
Yeah.
And I kind of had a great call with the regional manager, and that felt the right fit. Uganda is a beautiful country. I kind of believe passionately in what ICCO does, and it's really quite a very different country as well to Malawi.
Yeah. So for those listening who might not be aware, so Uganda had a pretty brutal war, just over a decade now. I guess it kind of closed. Would that be fair to say?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's always kind of a little bit of unrest in various parts, but it's been quite some time now. I think most people know Uganda for the days of Idi Amin, who was ousted a long time ago now. I think in the late 80s. I think.
Yeah.
My history's not very good, but it's been a president in place for like 33 years now, which kind of is less of a democracy, more of a dictatorship. That's not unusual in East Africa.
Yeah.
So there was a civil war in South Sudan. Actually, that's probably the most recent unrest, and there's been a lot of refugees who've fled South Sudan into Uganda. Uganda's got one of the most open policies to refugees. It allows anyone into Uganda if they're suffering from war.
Right.
And there's big refugee settlements in northern Uganda that we help provide skills training. So we help people develop businesses who are basically have been resettled from South Sudan to Uganda.
Yeah.
So Uganda itself actually has been peaceful for quite a long time, but it's had neighbors who've had issues.
Yeah.
But the big challenge in East Africa, and in fact in many countries around the world, is there's an enormously large population of young people, often now with skills, technology skills, who don't have jobs.
Right.
And that's a problem. It's going to become a big problem.
So when you talk about skills, what typical skills are these generations coming up with? Is it technology? Because what I'm getting at, if like the rest of the world it's technology, we start to think about like infrastructure, particularly around the internet and that kind of thing. So is it just jobs, or is it also things like infrastructure that are holding people back?
Well, infrastructure. I think the governments in some of these countries could be better. Corruption is an issue in varying degrees of each of the countries in Africa. I'm certain outside Africa as well.
Yeah.
There is I think the current generation are tech savvy. Most of the youth, particularly in the urban areas, have smartphones and they're all using Facebook and all the tools you have on your phone.
Yeah.
I think there's and that's actually influences many other aspects of East Africa, where I'm most familiar, life, in that technology is involved with renewable energy. So there's a lot of solar projects going on. Obviously, I was involved with that in Malawi.
Yeah.
But people are now able to pay via their phones. Mobile money has been a big enabler in Africa.
Right.
So people can pay for products, whether it's solar products or agricultural products, by paying over the phone.
Okay.
So it's the digital revolution is impacting every aspect of Africa.
Yeah.
And it's really it's becoming really a part of everyone's life. Everyone has a mobile money account. Everyone has a smartphone. everyone uses WhatsApp. It's
Yeah.
and it's crossovers as well. There's with agriculture, they're now irrigation pumps are solar powered. So in
Okay.
areas which didn't have water
Yeah.
now have water because they're able to have water pumped into that region using solar powered irrigation pumps.
Right.
And then now solar is becoming the cheapest form of power. There's lots of mini grids being built that are providing power to regions which are off the grid. In fact, the grid itself is becoming old-fashioned way of getting electricity.
Yeah.
It's so expensive to put pylons in the ground and cables for miles and miles across Africa.
Yeah.
So, for farmers, yes, it definitely is infrastructure. It's often training and knowing, certain heavily starch-rich produce which are grown, rice and potatoes and cassava and particularly maize is very popular.
Right.
But it's not very nutritious. So, there's a lot of focus on growing more nutritious crops in Africa.
Yep.
Cabbage and onions and tomatoes, which is, there isn't the knowledge on how to grow those in industrial quantities.
Right.
So,
okay.
It's that development. It's not just about digital, it's about knowledge. But a lot of that knowledge can be shared now by various digital means. There's apps being created which provide that kind of knowledge to farmers.
Okay.
We've in fact, ICCA itself have developed an app that enables small banks in Africa. They're called microfinance institutions,
Yeah.
MFIs. That allows loan officers to assess farmers for loans, so
Right.
they can invest in their farm to grow more crops. And
Okay.
it's this back to my kind of capitalist ideals. The focus isn't on the farmer. The focus is on the loan officer. You can make it really easy for a loan officer to decide whether a farmer is a good candidate for a loan. He's going to make that loan decision rather than lending it to a businessman in town.
Right.
So if you can make it easy for these MFIs to make loans, they'll make more loans and farmers will be able to invest in their farms, supported by organizations like ECO, produce more crops. And that whole aspect is a term called access to finance. So it's connecting these small finance institutions to the farmers and making it easy for these finance institutions to assess the risk of, will that farmer be able to repay the loan?
Yeah.
So it's money, it's technology, it's training, it's actually connecting the large international or even domestic distribution organizations and often it means banding farmers together.
Right.
So maybe they can share transportation for getting their crops to a central warehouse, and then once they get to the central warehouse, maybe we can then provide them credit for delivering their crops, rather than having to find a buyer there and then. So it's the whole building a market, particularly based on agriculture, because I think about 85% of the population in Africa is employed or involved in agriculture to a certain degree. So it's a agricultural based continent.
Yeah. I suppose the other thing, because I suppose really what you're getting at is that farmers and communities are becoming even more, I don't say insulated, but without having to rely, like you say, on having pylons put in the ground and everything else, that through solar, through the internet, you can stay localized, particularly in areas that are harder to get at geographically, right? If my farm's in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, Africa's big and the roads aren't great.
Right.
And so it is a challenge, but there's a lot of potential. There was a really interesting statistic I read the other day that there's 45 million people who live in Uganda. Uganda is a country with enormous amount of natural resources. What I mean by that is fertile soil, lots of rain, lots of sunshine, And if just Uganda adopted organic Western farming techniques, it could grow enough food for 350 million people.
Right.
But they're actually still importing a lot of their food because their farmers aren't efficient yet.
Right.
And Africa as a whole is an importer of food.
Yeah.
Even though, so if you could just change that equation, then it will make an enormous difference to the country.
Yeah.
There are challenges. As I said, it is infrastructure, it is government, but it's there is a lot of potential with now driven by a large population of educated youth, who actually want to they want to work, they want to have an opportunity. So there's a lot of kind of small businesses popping up now that are targeted towards helping farmers and agriculture, and it's the entrepreneurial spirit is alive and strong in Africa. In fact, it was the one thing that really did surprise me when I first arrived in Africa, is that everyone has 4 jobs. They don't just have their day job. They also are a chicken farmer or have a small plot of land. They grow their own crops.
Yeah.
So sometimes that leads to maybe a lack of focus, but there is a kind of an inherent entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah.
That we try to tap into.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think you answered my question, which was, in terms of efficiency of agriculture and so on, about how far these countries are away from a good export market. But it kind of sounds like a long way, right? If the majority of food is still being imported, despite all these, as you say, natural resources. From your perspective, how far out do you think places like Uganda are from becoming a little bit more self-sustaining and less reliant on imports?
Oh, what a good question.
Is it in our lifetime?
Well, something, it varies. Yeah, I think so. And it varies by country. I think I always catch myself not wanting to talk about Africa as a whole, because each country is in different stages of progress. Rwanda now, for example, the country that suffered a terrible genocide in 1994, is an incredibly stable and successful country. It reminds me of Switzerland.
Right.
You go to, it's amazing.
Yeah.
It is the cleanest streets, the best infrastructure, a lot of foreign investment. And that's largely because their president has really ruled the country with an iron fist, but fairly.
Yeah.
And has attracted foreign investment. So I think Rwanda is a few years away from really having a self-sustaining economy.
Yeah.
You can see it. It's not far. Meanwhile, on the other end of the spectrum, we have Zimbabwe, which is going through a horrible time right now. And I can't quite see how that comes to an end.
Right.
And it also depends on the kind of the tastes of the West. There's always a different agenda with each new. It feels like every decade there's different agendas. Currently, the donor focus, of the European Union in particular, is to generate jobs in North Africa.
Right.
Because if you generate jobs in North Africa, you get less immigration into Europe.
Right.
And that's so a lot of dollars being spent in areas where eco is focused, which is job creation. And I agree with that. If you can help people stay at home and feed their families and become successful and live a good life, and if that prevents them from having to move north and all the challenges that creates, that's a worthwhile goal.
Yeah.
But that's currently that agenda is being driven by the development money from the European Union and the European governments.
Okay. Okay. When you joined the ICCA, what do you call it, ICO or IC? I'll call it the ICCO. You move from volunteer. Now you're actually in employment, right? Now you're actually an employee. And you'd mentioned before about moving to developing countries, about having this idea that you have an exit. Is that the same for where you are now, or given the size of the challenge, is this sort of where you'll stay? Do you think there's a time where you'll be able to leave?
Yeah, I do, and I think I'm always planning for that.
Right.
What's particularly challenging with ICCO is it's going through a transition of having a kind of large sums of funding being distributed by the Dutch government to a very, very competitive model, where we have to compete with global NGOs. So there's a big transition we're trying to manage. So I think there's quite a lot of work to do before the organization is now a lean and competitive, non-Dutch government dependent NGO.
Right.
But my goal is to develop the team under me for me to move on. Yeah. So I guess the unspoken question is, how long is that? I think it's a year or 2 years, I think.
Yeah. And
then by then, I'd like to think the team that I put in place will take on kind of the work that we've done. There's a lot of system work that we're putting in place. There wasn't the right systems. There was a need to decentralize the management of the organization from the Netherlands into the region. So there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah,
absolutely. The goal is to ultimately develop the local organization to absorb my role.
Yeah. You have an interesting story because when I think back to other people that I've spoken to who've done work in Africa, not along the same lines as you, they speak of, and this is going back some time, they spoke of their frustration at the lack of progress from all sides, government or corruption, as you say, the size of the problem. But it kind of sounds to me that actually, and maybe it's a sign of the times, that you've actually experienced being there and being able to make a difference and seeing that difference grow exponentially. Would you kind of agree with that?
Yes, I think the development sector is evolving. I do think there's more focus on job creation, obviously responding to crisis, floods and wars and droughts, that type of thing. That's a humanitarian responsibility. But in terms of the development focus on job creation, I think is right now. I think you talked about this fourth sector. I do think you've got to find that balance between the private sector, government, and the NGOs. They have to work together.
Yeah.
And when they walk away from a project, that project has to live on. And that's what we often find with development projects. Once the project stops, the objectives of the project just kind of fizzle out because it's not built for sustainability, which is a phrase that's overused, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But projects have to live on once the NGO has finished its work. And I think that's getting much better. But I think the missing piece is still the governments in Africa.
Right. So
they need to do more.
You're right. And you touched on something there, which is, as you say, the word sustainability. And you mentioned it's getting better, but so what you found then is that the NGOs come in on these projects and leave, and a lot of times the project dies or fizzles out. Is that like a common majority thing? Because as you said, when you were in Malawi, there was a swarming with NGOs. So is that typically the case that these there's a lot of projects going on, but they have a life cycle. They start, they have a middle, they have an end, and that's it. Is there projects that are truly sustainable, are they still a minority, or is that getting better?
Well, I think it's getting better. I think it's probably difficult to tell. As I said, you split projects into humanitarian projects, but there's a need you have to address.
Yeah.
Development projects, I think now I would say the majority, the focus is on having very clear metrics to measure whether the project is making an impact. Have you truly improved the wealth of the beneficiaries on the project?
Yeah.
And maybe a good example is one of the things we found in when I first went to Malawi. There was a project where we were being asked by an NGO to train people from the rural community to be solar sales agents, and so we, I looked into the project, and I was told that the previous year there was 1,000 people were trained,
right?
And I asked a very simple question: of those 1,000 people, how many became successful solar agents? They were invited to a 2-day training course. They were given a free sample solar light. We paid their transportation, their meals. Okay, so how many of those 1,000 people we trained became successful resellers of solar lights? And I remember the look I got when I asked that question was of, why would you care? We trained 1,000 people. That was what the metric was on the project.
Right.
We trained 1,000 people.
Yeah.
Well, I did my homework. We actually, out of those 1,000 people, only 3 of them went on to become successful solar agents.
Okay.
So the metric was wrong. The way of measuring success was wrong. So the next program, we had 20 people we trained, not 1,000, and 18 of them became successful solar agents who then built a solar business, who then employed staff, and then sold far more lights to children who are in villages without electricity, who are now able to read at night. So the actual outcome was better, but the initial project was the wrong measure. And I think that is a very simple example of the change going on in the development sector. Is how do you truly measure the impact of the project? And I think that's an area which has become like a profession on its own in the development sector, monitoring and evaluation. You've got to pick the right criteria.
Right. And in terms of, I suppose, for those providing funding as well, that's become key, right? Which is, where's our money being spent, and what's not the return, but what is the result, right? As you say, you train 1,000 people and 3 salespeople.
Yeah, and there's various regulations being passed. I know in the Netherlands, but I think in Europe as a whole, that development organizations have to provide complete transparency on these metrics. So, on these, in how many farmers have grown their annual income based upon the work we've done. That would be a good metric, for example. Okay. If we've done all this training, we've connected them with the market, we've provided them access to finance, can we demonstrate that we're increasing their annual income? Those metrics we are now required to provide them on our website, so the taxpayers in the countries that we operate in can see results of our projects. So it's like a lot of these things. It's transparency is improving, the metrics are improving, and as a result, the projects are better, more focused, rather than broad strokes, more surgical, and involving the private sector.
And in your role in finance, having this link with the Netherlands, the skills that you've, the skills that you've had, the UK, the US, is that just something you've carried on into Africa? Have there been particular challenges related to your skill set that you've had to kind of develop while you're there?
Yes, and there's also been a strange reuse of skills that I had that I developed in my time in the US I wasn't expecting. So the first thing is these projects require a level of grant accounting, and it's quite technical and it's very precise
Right.
and very regulation driven. It's like a whole new tax code.
Right.
So you have to learn that pretty quick if you're in finance and the development sector. But as part of my role at ICCO, we're building this app for MFIs, these microfinance organizations, to help their loan officers, assess farmers for credit risk.
Yeah.
And that's required us to develop a cloud app, which is going to be used on tablets by farmers going into the field, often without telecommunication or network access.
Yeah.
And we've had to build a licensing model and a business model that lives on beyond the project.
Okay.
So that was my background. I'm building a software sales model for selling this application to these hundreds of thousands of small little banks in Africa who service the farmers. It's got to be good enough for them to be willing to pay for it.
Yeah.
So suddenly I'm selling software in Africa, or not quite selling it, but part of building a software industry in Africa. And of course, that is very consistent with my background.
Yeah. I kind of want to round off with just some questions. First of all, around for anybody listening who has a desire, whether it's whatever the calling is, to go to Africa and to help. What would be your advice? What would be and in the context of career and personal development, as well as being able to help these countries? What's your advice? What would you tell someone who's thinking about doing what you've done and doesn't know where to start?
Well, okay, that's another good question. So we started off as a volunteer in Malawi, and that role actually ended up becoming an employee in Malawi. So my second employee role was in Uganda with ICCO, but you start off as a volunteer,
right?
And then that gets you on the ground, connected. So I think be willing to be a volunteer first is rule number one.
Yeah.
Second thing is, depends what your background is. With my accounting background, what I didn't mention was that when I started to look for something to do after the US, I looked at my accounting association's website, and they had an agency associated with the website called AFID, Accounting for International Development, AFID.
Right.
That's basically a non-profit recruitment agency that looks for accountants, in my case, chartered management accountants, and places you in assignments overseas, both volunteer and permanent positions.
Yeah.
And they placed me in Malawi, and they placed me in this position in Uganda, and that's what they do.
Yeah.
That's their for accountants like me who decided they want to go and leave the private sector. They find you positions in the developing nations, in the development sector.
Yeah.
Now, that's not if you're an accountant. If you're an economist, or if you're into agriculture, an engineer, my suggestion there is to probably look at the EU volunteer program. If you're in Europe, I'm certain there's equivalent programs. You just type volunteer programs in Google. There's all sorts of different programs sponsored by various governments in the US and in Europe. But as an accountant, it's particularly, as anyone with a finance background, it's very easy to using via an agency like AFID.
Okay. Is there, from your experience and where you are now, is there any particular job roles that that are in demand that you could fill pretty quickly with the right people?
Yeah, it's. I think there's a program management is a big deal in all the development sector.
Yeah.
So anybody with project management experience is a sought after skill. So, all these projects I talk about are very much about delivering projects. So if somebody is a project manager in the US, those same skills can be applied as a volunteer first, typically, but then that can be then migrated into a permanent position. So
Yeah.
finance and project managers are the two skills I think are most sought after in developing nations.
Yeah.
Delivering projects on time, on budget.
Right.
So that's what tends to be a struggle.
Yeah. Okay. And so, for you then, what do you think is next? Are you and your wife just kind of you'll move on when the time is right and take whatever opportunity comes up, or is there a plan? Where do you kind of see things going?
Yeah, there is a plan. I think I want to see this transition of the ICCA organization into a lean and very innovative NGO, focused on developing the agriculture sector in Africa. I think there's a lot of work to do. I want to see that through till I can see the finish line. I don't necessarily want to take it over the finishing line. I want to see the finishing line.
Yeah.
But I think what I've learned about myself is I'm not a salesperson. I actually enjoy coaching, mentoring, and that's really what I've been doing here in Africa. You're looking at bringing some experiences and skills from the private sector, which I think is important, to Africa and helping develop business. So I think maybe next is some form of business studies, teaching, mentoring, coaching somewhere in the world.
Okay.
Not sure what or when.
Yeah.
But I think that is my next calling. But there's still here first.
Yeah. And do you see that? Do you see yourself coming back to the US or UK permanently as part of that, or is there a desire always to be in emerging markets and economies?
Yeah, I think I can't see myself back in the US or the UK now. This whole experience has been so life-changing. I go back to the US and I see a number of things I don't think I could reconcile with again. The limited amount of personal time people have, leave time, the hours that people work.
Yeah.
I'm not saying I work any less, but I feel I have a more balanced life.
Right.
And I think one thing I felt now in hindsight, in the US, you tend to work to have money to spend.
Yeah.
And I've kind of moved away from consumerism a little bit. So I feel that the US is a great place to build a career, but I think maybe I'm looking for a kind of a simpler life now than the kind of the hard charging US corporate lifestyle. So I don't know. My wife's Colombian, so the chances are it might be Colombia.
Okay. Excellent. Well, Phil, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. I know it's probably late there in Beirut now, but you have a great story, and I hope it serves as inspiration for anybody who gets to listen to this. So I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. And I suppose all that's left to say is Happy New Year.
Exactly. And one thing I've also learned is Beirut is the place to be for New Year's Eve. What a town.
Really?
It's amazing. Yeah, I know. A number of people said, are you sure? But it is an absolutely amazing place. So my last advert is, if you ever want to take a exciting trip, Beirut's the place to come. It's amazing. It really is. So I'll be celebrating here, and Happy New Year to you too.
Yeah, thank you very much.